So next paper is by Edward Puckner. Edward Puckner earned his doctorate in art history from Indiana University and currently serves as curator of exhibitions for the McKissick Museum at the University of South Carolina. He has received fellowships from Frederick Douglass Institute at the University of Rochester, the Luce Foundation, and the Philadelphia Museum of Art. Ned has also worked at the Indiana University Art Museum and the National Gallery of Art in Washington, D.C. His article, Winning the Peace Over Mr. Prejudice, Horace Pippin and the Social Gospel and the Double V, was recently published in connection with the exhibition Horace Pippin, The Way I See It, now on view at the Brandywine River Museum of Art. His research interests include African American art, American modernism, contemporary art, folk, self-taught, outsider art, and the material culture of American religions. His paper today is part of a larger study that will result in an exhibition at the McKissick Museum next year.
Thank you, Tatiana, and thank you to everyone organizing this conference. It's been really wonderful. So how do I advance? Oh, okay. Thank you. Sorry. In the immediate aftermath of the Pearl Harbor attack, two of the largest African-American newspapers, the Baltimore Afro-American and the Chicago Defender, each published editorial cartoons showing public response to the attack and to the country's entry into World War II. On the left, we see an upright citizen eagerly offering his service to President Roosevelt and his Joint Chiefs, who each look up from their war plans entitled How to Lick Japan. With broad shoulders and a rigid stance, the central figure's salute communicates loyalty and a sense of duty among readers of the African-American press. On the right, we encounter Uncle Sam, standing on a pulpit, loosely fitted with a preacher's robe and an awkward, phony halo, preaching to opposition leaders of the Axis forces. Startled by a bottle that slips from his pocket labeled Racial Intolerance, Exploitation 165 Years Old, Uncle Sam mutters, "Don't do as I do as I say," as he reveals the embarrassing liquor that undermines his words and sends a chuckle through his audience. Embodying both pessimism and scorn on the one hand, and hope, enthusiasm, and courage on the other, these two cartoons display the sharp contrast of opinions shared by many African Americans as they confronted the new reality and consequences of America's imminent fight for democracy abroad. These two cartoons raise broader questions about how editorial cartoons complemented larger dialogic shifts in the wartime media. As mass-produced images released weekly to millions of readers, newspaper cartoons reflected and shaped popular opinion. They afforded singular images that summed up new messaging, new policy, and new sentiments, forging a rich, unified site of political awareness and engagement for African Americans across the nation. The following study tracks the modes by which cartoons of the African American press navigated a sensitive balance at play within the press between a militant voice struggling for racial justice and an outwardly patriotic image of action pushing up against threats of government sanction. It surveys cartoons within the Defender and the Afro-American over the war's first year, revealing an effort to forge a new image of a modern African American. Overcoming the lean Depression years with great increases in circulation, the combined newspapers of the black press reached over 1 million readers nationwide by 1940, becoming one of the leading African American run industries. And the figures are that in 1940 there were 1.2 million subscribers with a secondary readership of close to 6 million. Those are estimates. And that increased to 1.8 million by 1945. With this increase, editors for many large syndicated newspapers modified their messaging with the onset of the war effort to match reader interests. For example, scholars note that much of the crime-related news that had previously dominated the peacetime press was steadily eliminated to make space for an important new emphasis: stories of black troops and their role in the services. Newspapers also brought in more columnists, representing an enormous range of interests and philosophies, from conservative to radical. These strategic changes were a coordinated effort aimed at not only stimulating sales, but also to giving voice to emerging audiences that were increasingly urban, literate, and militant. The centrality of the African American soldier within these cartoons is not surprising. As David Carrier writes, the meaning and content of cartoons and comics, quote, is determined not by the artist, but by the audience, reflecting the fantasies of its public, end quote. The soldier was an effective public image for pointing to the country's military, its fight for democracy, and in this case, its racial iniquities. In these cartoons, men and women were assigned with almost endless potential, encouraged by the belief that each of them could disrupt assumed notions of inferiority rampant within every sector of the war industry at the time. The soldier image mediated a desire for a new African-American hero, doing so by accomplishing three tasks. First, it allowed cartoonists to render a variety of race issues on an individual scale, making them more readable and giving voice to those people oppressed by them. Second, it presented a dual image, at once positive, patriotic, cleverly protesting institutionalized discrimination in the military, and engaging otherwise lukewarm attitudes that many African Americans had for the war. And third, it functioned to advance the representation of African Americans, instilling a self-image as a modern soldier or modern American, replacing derogatory, stereotypical caricatures by whites from decades past. A cartoon in the Baltimore Afro-American from January 13, 1942, offers a good starting point. Quoting heavily from Rodin's Thinker, the cartoonist centers the image on the African American's capacity for knowledge. A static figure, this black draftee helps convey the sage, hopeful advice of its adjacent opinion column. Quote, America needs all the trained men she can get. Whatever difficulties there may be in getting into the armed services, into industry and manufacturing today, these will not exist tomorrow. Any bright young man can get ahead if he will fight his way into and through the defense schools to a skilled trade. If he will stay out of the bright night spots and burn the midnight oil instead, this is where the dividends are for the duration. The strong and well-prepared will be pushed ahead, end quote. The column lays out an almost inevitable future, clinging tightly to the American dream. Work hard, get pushed ahead. Yet key to this success is the phrase, if you fight your way. The column and cartoon make direct calls for eligible men and women to insist upon receiving training and work past the threats of Jim Crow. Jay Jackson's cartoon, Still Not Too Late to Cut His Bonds, in the Chicago Defender from the same week, takes a different approach to the same point. Here, the biblical tale of Samson and Delilah becomes transposed onto the battle for racial parity within all branches of the military. Garbed in a seductive dress of stars and stripes that would make Uncle Sam's head spin, Delilah cuts Samson's braids, binds his arms, and wakes him just as the Philistines are upon them. Samson is astonished to witness his vulnerability. With clues superimposed onto the shorn hair and restraints, the cartoon image gives meaning to the helplessness felt by millions of African American recruits who were passed over by the draft in the opening months of the war. Later in January, the Defender cartoon, Black Men Too Die in the Navy, pays tribute to Dory Miller, the African American messman who went above and beyond his duties during the Pearl Harbor attack. Miller's name had not been released by this time, and so his vague, floating image remains a hazy personage bathed in light. Yet he is balanced with a seemingly dramatic transfer of relief funds below from champion boxer and newly minted recruit Joe Louis to the U.S. Navy. The pairing takes up the frustration of the week's editorials. As one writer laments, quote, Negroes by the thousands are buying defense savings bonds and stamps. Despite this, our government remains unchanged in its policy of segregation, end quote. Elsewhere, another protests the refusal of black youth by recruiting offices, asking emphatically, quote, does the government want the Negro in this war, end quote. However, the cartoon appears to resolve the protests, suggesting that Dory Miller's inspirational story gave meaning to the donation of African American aid. Even with the refusals African Americans faced at the recruiting offices, the best and the brightest of the race were donating to the war effort. As a result, a new iconic image, a hazy paradigm, was sure to emerge. Another Defender cartoon in early February entitled Can't See the Good for the Blot broadens our perspective beyond America's borders. A North African fighter stands in front of an oversized leaflet blotted with an ink stain that reads American and British race prejudice. Echoing the week's polemic against a pan-American diplomatic recommendation pushing South American republics to cut ties with the Axis powers, the cartoon offers a disparaging perspective on attitudes towards the U.S., what one columnist characterized as, quote, an attitude brought about by America's unpalatable racial superiority as manifested in the outrageous treatment of her black minority, a treatment scarcely distinguishable from that of Jewish minorities in the Hitler-dominated countries, end quote. No longer focused on racial discrimination on the home front, the editorial looks outward. The selection of a soldier here helps drive home the inimical effects of American and British discrimination, but also alludes to the idea that the dual American struggles to save democracy abroad and to battle racism at home are not unique. Other powerful allies, other soldiers of color the world over, may be considering the peace aims of the Allied forces, weighing the consequences of choosing sides with profound skepticism. 2 weeks later, in the end of February, the Defender published Transfusion Needed, the Sooner the Better, rendering a timely image focused squarely on the discriminatory policies of the Red Cross that barred African Americans from donating blood to the war effort. The organization had just changed its policy, accepting African American blood but keeping it segregated. For many, this plan only fueled resentment for the war effort. With its tiny subtitles, the cartoon expands the focus away from this lesser issue to more significant meanings at play. The profound need for more African Americans in all branches of U.S. defense efforts. It presents a clean, uncomplicated image with a white nurse administering the process. A healthy African-American, natural-born worker and fighter smiles calmly as his blood is drawn and transferred directly to a weak, emaciated white man. The forbidden transfusion is removed from time and place. No visual cues tell us the cause for the illness. No frontline location is given. We simply witness the donation of African-American might to the war. Over the first 2 months of 1942, Jay Jackson and the syndicated cartoonists of the Afro-American remained consistent in their use of male heroic figures like these. These cartoons show limitless potential for action, a seeming righteousness, a selflessness, and a generosity of spirit that are matched only by the government's ability to deny training. Jay Jackson, Wilbert Holloway, Francis Yancey, George Mercer, E. Sims Campbell, Oliver Harrington, and many cartoonists working for the press at this time consciously selected, structured, and captioned this soldier image, doing so with details that, in truth, rose above the message of the editorials. Their work, both in cartoons and comic strips, expanded the possibilities of cartoon imagery more generally to combat negative stereotyping of African Americans. Oliver Harrington, who contributed comic strips and was likely the cartoonist behind some of the Afro-American cartoons seen here, attests to specifically defining his figures in reaction to the derogatory imagery of decades earlier, like the examples seen here. He stated, quote, black faces were always represented as a circle, black with 2 hot dogs in the middle for a mouth. The black figure in my cartooning, it was a conscious effort on my part to change that. The black had to disappear. The rubber lips had to disappear, end quote. Harrington's urgent need to counteract negative imagery and eradicate the black and the lips stems from what Michael Harris identifies as a conceptual incarceration. He writes, quote, the derogatory and stereotypical imagery found in 19th century minstrel performance and popular media combined with political, social, and economic oppression and the official and renegade enforcement of racial ideology to control and trap the black individual within his or her community and ultimately within his or her body, end quote. Harrington, Jackson, and others clearly utilized their cartoons to break free of this control. In the pages of the African American press, there is a rather consistent focus on the figure, aggressively pinpointing and acting against this history. Harrington, in particular, states that he turned to the work of Milton Caniff at this time, whose action-adventure comic strip Terry and the Pirates set new standards of comic art with its authentic, highly detailed backgrounds and dramatically staged figures. The effort to re-image the figure was not unique to cartoonists, though. By 1940, large circulation newspapers like the Afro-American, the Defender, and the Pittsburgh Courier shared images of and information about African Americans for African Americans in a variety of positive ways. Advertisements, for example, guided readers through society, suggesting where to shop without humiliation or where to apply for a job that would not discriminate. Newspapers also included sports and society pages praising athletes and professionals, otherwise ignored by the white press. Many of the larger papers also formally organized in 1940, creating the National Negro Publishers Association, or NNPA. A vitally important coalition of editors, the NNPA facilitated a unified viewpoint and coordinated policies among the country's largest papers. Within 3 months after the start of World War II, they also adopted a war resolution, pledging to collectively campaign for victory at home and abroad. This morphed into unique yet aligned campaigns. The Double V campaign, initiated by the Pittsburgh Courier and the Baltimore Afro-American, and the Defenders' Remember Pearl Harbor and Sikeston Too. Generating national debate, they advocated participation in the war and an equal protest against racism and discrimination on the home front. The Chicago Defenders campaign linked the Pearl Harbor attack with a horrific lynching in Sikeston, Missouri that occurred in January 1942, itself a recurrent theme in the wartime press. Well aware that these campaigns would unquestionably foretell clashes with the government, the coalition of the NNPA offered each newspaper a level of confidence through a vast organizational network of partnerships. Columnists of the white press immediately labeled the black press an organ of protest. Black editors, in turn, reverted the white response to their audience, saying, quote, "To the Negro and his press alike, the efforts of a large section of white America to check his protest rather than examine and act upon its causes seem utterly at variance with the avowed democratic objectives of the present world struggle," end quote. Though skillfully designed to spur debate, such statements agitated government agencies. One historian writes, quote, "It became increasingly clear to many editors just how seriously their position with the government had deteriorated when scare words such as suppression and sedition charges began to filter into the newspaper offices," end quote. 6 different agencies, from the FBI to the post office, began investigations into various African American newspapers in early 1942. Editors of the black press and civic leaders were asked to meet with the FBI about the popularity of their campaigns and the threat to African American morale. Though some scholars note that these meetings only solidified the racial militancy of the press, others reveal a more positive outcome. Historians Charles Simmons and Patrick Washburn refer to these meetings as actually forestalling more excessive levels of militancy. Simmons writes, quote, "Despite the militant front originally presented by editors, government officials were so persuasive with their talks that some editors decided to take another look at their editorial philosophies and agreed to approach new opinions with some caution," end quote. While it is unclear which editors softened their stance or how their influence made its way through the NNPA, aspects of this modified approach seem to inflect the cartoons that followed in notable ways. Within the first 3 issues of the Chicago Defender in March, Within the first 3 issues of the Chicago Defender in March of 1942, we see action, no longer dwelling on giving blood or insisting on training. The new African American soldier here exemplifies engagement, readiness, and loyalty. In alienating the affections of his strongest ally in the upper left corner, for example, a hulking, oversized African American figure representing the combined strength of the world's colored races and sympathies rises up, breaking his chains with a clenched fist as he turns his attention to the minuscule race baiter brandishing a sword in his opposite hand. Behind the massive form, another tiny avatar of Nazism quips, "I hope they never get together and team up on me." In the Defender's "So Sorry Please" at the bottom from a week later, a black GI, newly arrived in Australia, grits his teeth and crouches next to a sign proclaiming "No colored races allowed." His grimace and tight grip on the trigger signal a fierce anger and defiance that appears as directed at the sign as it is at the enemy. Even so, he appears to trudge on to battle. The following week's cartoon, "She Delivered Me and I Will Deliver Her," on the upper right, shows Lady Democracy under siege, Her home, in the background, now in flames, democracy is held in a stranglehold by a wide-eyed Nazi officer. Glowering as he shouts, "Loose me," a stern, powerful African-American man rolls up his sleeve, about to wallop the forces of race prejudice that keep him from saving her. A short essay accompanies this scene with the ending, quote, "Mr. President, if you have an answer for Japan, Italy, and Germany, here are those who will speed it to them. Speed it in tracks of blood, with hearts as loyal as unyielding faith. Here they are, Mr. President, ready, eager, loyal, true as the stars," end quote. Featuring the heightened drama of action-adventure comic strips, the cartoon seems to unleash the African-American soldier, portraying him as the only hope for democracy. Presenting action, loyalty, and change, other subsequent cartoons suggest that women complete this hopeful, patriotic, galvanizing image, too. Invoking notables Sojourner Truth and Harriet Beecher Stowe, the image on the right carries an editorial with the decrees, quote, "So they are, ready, eager for war's alarms, its suffering and sacrifices, readier than thousands of brothers, as ready as any women called by the Union to the colors of freedom," end quote. By contrast, the cartoon on the left offers frank comment on the politically engaged domestic, burdened with the mundane. Others, like Back to Defense, make stinging attacks on the unfortunate politics behind the Women's Auxiliary Corps that undermined efforts to attract African-American recruits. The recruits themselves are model citizens, though, loyal to the flag and insistently walking past barriers. To return to David Carrier's phrase, we see fantasies of the public emerging here. As a quick survey of later cartoons from 1942 illustrate, whether acknowledging new policy changes, questioning the very nature of victory, or dramatizing the historical moment through comedic tropes, the soldier humanized abstract comments at work within Jim Crow society and the government-military complex. He or she also iterated a mental image for millions of readers of what action and loyalty look like, forming positive, encouraging models that function to spur debate, boost morale, and temper excessive militancy. Cartoons like these reflect the complexity of the African-American experience during World War II. They alternate between a true hero or shining example and its opposite, lashing out against preconceived notions of patriotism, yet also enriching them. The new soldiers here are historical correctives, disruptive agents of voice and action, representing unique amalgams of loyalty to American democracy and protest against the morally wrong elements within it. In truth, both sides of this subtle dualism remained crucial. Cartoonists had to appease both conservative and militant factions and reassure government agencies that they would keep up morale for the war. By keeping the public fantasy of an African-American soldier fresh in the minds of readers week after week, cartoonists did both. Humor is a historical, cultural product, changing as social mores and lifestyles shift to keep up with a modern world. As a public locus of humor, these cartoons helped readers identify with a new image, a modern soldier, and mediate strong feelings about the needs, fears, and identity of communities nationwide. Each cartoon thus occupies a somewhat reflexive function, one built off of reader response, filtered by an editor and interpreted by an artist, from source to message to cultural product. As we begin to reconstruct the humor of this era, the emergence of this hero confirms new elements of the African-American experience, fighting for country, fighting for rights, turning away from the past, and fighting for a better future. Thank you.